Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show for Wednesday, December the 8th, 2021. Oh my, that's a little too bright. Not any better? Okay, that should be optimal, I think. Die for Donbas. Is that what's going to happen? That's, of course, referring to a phrase, a mocking phrase in the late 1930s, a die for Danzig, which was in the Polish corridor, a disputed area between Poland and Germany, and perhaps, well, one of the proximate causes of the beginning of World War II. I think about World War I a lot, and how did that come about? The greatest self-inflicted wound in modern Western history. Was it boredom, the imp of the perverse, as Edgar Allan Poe would say? Is that what we're looking at now with the Biden administration? Oh, and the other members of NATO, an organization which should have been scrapped decades ago. But I guess the military contractors wouldn't like that very much. Here's a piece in the American Thinker by Selwyn Duke. Are you ready for nuclear war over Ukraine? Do you know we don't rule out first use nuclear action? So said Senator Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi, while outlining what measures the United States could take against Russia over Ukraine, at whose border Moscow has been massing troops. The senator's office later clarified that this comment related to American policy in general and not specifically to Russia. While this is actually believable, Wicker made a loose comment. What's unbelievable is that we're even considering a military confrontation with Moscow over something that does not at all involve a U.S. national interest. Moreover, what else Wicker said during a recent interview with Fox News host Neil Cavuto is not reassuring. To wit, well, military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russia military capability, the Independent related him as stating. It could mean that we participate, and I would not rule that out. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. Making it worse is that the Biden administration and the establishment in general are all in on this Dr. Strangelove foreign policy. As Secretary of State Tony Blinken's spokesman Ned Price has put it, quote, if Russia chooses to fail to de-escalate, we and our allies would be prepared to act. We would be prepared to act resolutely. Equally troubling is that geniuses in both parties are pushing to have Ukraine become part of NATO, with its attack on one is an attack on all policy. This means that if Russia then invaded Ukraine, the US and Western Europe would be obligated to intervene militarily. World War III, anyone? For his part, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that NATO troop and weapons deployment to Ukraine is a red line for him. Of course it is. Just as we couldn't back down during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Russia wouldn't back down on Ukraine. The same is true of China vis-a-vis Taiwan. Like it or not, you must tread softly in another great power's backyard. Enter it and refuse to back down, and war will almost assuredly result because that power can't realistically back down. Doing so would mean losing face and sending the ultimate message of weakness. For if you can be pushed around at your own doorstep, in what way can't you be dominated? Despite this, our chicken hawks insist on playing chicken with a nuclear power over what? Few ask what the national interest is, and no one explains. We do hear bloviating about Ukraine's sovereignty and border integrity from the same people who've made our border a sieve-like conduit for a southern invasion, as Tucker Carlson pointed out last night. These people also talk about defending democracy. Yes, and I won't read the end of that paragraph. Then last year, sociopathic Congressman Adam Schiff actually said that we aid, quote, Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here. You might remember that ill-fated line from the early 2000s. Yes, we're bombing the hell out of the Near East. We're killing them there so we don't have to kill them here. Of course, we wouldn't have the need to worry about them if we stopped importing them. But no, that would be racist or against diversity or something like that. The columnist continues, perhaps Shifty has been watching the flick Red Dawn too much. In other words, if you thought there couldn't be anything as irrational as our coronavirus policy, where authorities insist on reordering civilization over a pathogen that more than 99.9% of the infected will survive, welcome to our Russia policy. We're acting as if a nation with an economy 1/8 the size of China's is today's Roman Empire and we're Gaul. Our cure of military intervention in its backyard would definitely be worse than the disease, too. Russia is now the COVID-19 of geopolitics. To be clear, none of this concerns whether you love, hate, or are indifferent about Putin. It's not about whether Russia is right or wrong on Ukraine. It's about applying just war doctrine. And again, recognizing that you can only do so much at a great power's doorstep. An aside, note that both our world wars, along with the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, began under Democrat administrations. And having in power detached from reality leftists who can't judge human nature as we do today is always dangerous. In fact, if they stay at the helm long enough, their folly may provide for their voters a harsh object lesson in how there are really things worse than white privilege, microaggressions, and sexual constraints. Again, this is Selwyn Duke at the AmericanThinker.com. Bob Dole, when he was running for president in 1976, made a comment about Democrat wars. Oh, and the Democrats howled in outrage. Well, it's true, though, isn't it? So, okay, why are we here? Why are we in this ridiculous position? Well, we're in this ridiculous position for this reason, that the United States made a promise to Mikhail Gorbachev, which it broke. Now, lots of people will tell you, no, there was no promise. Well, here we go. This is from Dave Majumdar at the nationalinterest.org, December 12th, 2017. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was given a host of assurances that the NATO alliance would not expand past what was then the East German border in 1990, according to new declassified documents. Russian leaders often complain that NATO extended an invitation to Hungary, Poland, and what was then Czechoslovakia to join the alliance in 1997 at the Madrid summit in contravention of assurances offered to the Soviet Union before its 1991 collapse. The alliance has dismissed the notion that such assurances were offered, however. Scholars have continued to debate the issue for years now, however. Newly declassified documents show that Gorbachev did, in fact, receive assurances that NATO would not expand past East Germany. The documents show that multiple national leaders were considering and rejecting Central and Eastern European membership in NATO as of early 1900 and through 1991. George Washington University National Security Archives researchers Svetlana Savranskaya and Tom Blanton wrote that discussions of NATO in the context of German unification negotiations in 1990 were not at all narrowly limited to the status of East German territory, and that subsequent Soviet and Russian complaints about being misled about NATO expansion were founded in Britain contemporaneous memcoms and telcoms at the highest level. Indeed, Russian presidents Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin have complained bitterly about the expansion of NATO towards their borders, despite what they had believed were assurances to the contrary. What happened to those assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? Putin said at the Munich Conference on Security Policy in 2007. No one even remembers them, but I will allow myself to remind this audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of NATO General Secretary Werner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said at the time that, quote, the fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee, unquote. Putin asked, where are these guarantees? As the newly declassified documents show, the Russians might have had a point. Well, it was previously understood that Secretary of State James Baker's assurance to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand not 1 inch eastward during a February 9th, 1990 meeting was only in the context of German reunification. The new documents show that this was not the case. Not only did the United States and NATO break its promise to Russia, it did worse than that. A very nasty woman indeed called Victoria Nuland, who coincidentally is married to Neocon Supremo Robert Kagan. She is now Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Biden administration. Yeah, I'm going to read from Wikipedia here. Nuland was the lead U.S. point person for the Ukrainian crisis. Yeah, that's one way to describe an American, also Canada was involved in Britain, a coup d'etat, a replacement of a democratically elected government in Ukraine, establishing loan guarantees to Ukraine, including a $1 billion loan guarantee in 2014, and the provisions of the non-lethal assistance to the Ukrainian military and border guard. Along with Secretary of State John Kerry and Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, she is seen as a leading supporter of defensive weapons delivery to Ukraine. What exactly are defensive weapons? Are there a special kind of weapon that can't kill people? It's just defensive. Couldn't possibly be offensive. In 2016, Nuland urged Ukraine to start prosecuting corrupt officials. Yeah. But Joe Biden put paid to that to protect his son, Hunter, didn't he? During a June 7, 2016 Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing titled Russian Violations of Borders, Treaties, and Human Rights, Nuland described U.S. diplomatic outreach to the former Soviet Union and efforts to build a constructive relationship with Russia. Very satirical. On February 4th, 2014, a recording of a phone call between Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, on January 28, 2014, was published on YouTube. In their phone conversation, Nuland and Pyatt discussed who should join a unity government, to include Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and in what ways they might achieve that outcome. Yatsenyuk became Prime Minister of Ukraine on February 24, 2014. After discussing Ukrainian opposition figures, they discussed that the EU would not commit to mediate, with Nuland adding, quote, F the EU, unquote. Only she didn't say F. Pyatt responds, oh, exactly. So the United States, along with support of other countries, instituted a phony crisis in Ukraine in order to pull off a coup d'etat. And now the West, led by the United States, is the guarantor of Ukraine, which is the most corrupt country in what might be called a Western civilization. This country, despite the richness of the resources that it has a per capita GDP less than half of that of Belarus. Yes, Belarus. And who runs the Ukraine? The strangest coalition in history, a coalition of Jewish oligarchs and neo-Nazis. Not, basement dwellers, LARPing. No, real neo-Nazis, such as the Azov Brigade. And what possible reason the United States, Britain, Canada, or whatever would have in the Ukraine? Well, I know the interest that Canada has in the Ukraine is because Chrystia Freeland, who was formerly Canada's foreign minister, now Minister of Finance, and is widely tipped to succeed Justin Trudeau, perhaps as early as next year. One of her grandfathers was a leading Nazi collaborator who ended up at the end of the war in Munich as an OSS asset. Chrystia Freeland's mother co-wrote the Ukrainian Constitution, and Chrystia Freeland and her sister own an apartment in Kiev. Nothing unusual about that, is there? That doesn't suggest deep state at all or glowing in the dark, does it? Oh, no, no, no. Pat Buchanan's column yesterday, Putin to Biden, Finlandize Ukraine or we will. Neocons and Republican hawks, such as the late John McCain, sought to bring Ukraine and two other ex-Soviet republics, Georgia and Moldova, into NATO. Putin, who served in the KGB in the late Soviet era and calls the breakup of the USSR the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, is now saying enough is enough. Either the US and NATO provide us with legal guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO or become a base for weapons that can threaten Russia, or we will go in and guarantee it ourselves. This is the message Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending, backed by the 100,000 troops Russia has amassed on Ukraine's borders. Putin said last week, the threat on our western borders is rising, as we have said multiple times. In our dialogue with the United States and its allies, we will insist on developing concrete agreements prohibiting any further eastward expansion of NATO and the placement there of weapons systems in the immediate vicinity of Russian territory. That comes close to an ultimatum, and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg backhanded the president of Russia for issuing it. It's only Ukraine and 30 NATO allies that decide when Ukraine is ready to join NATO. Russia has no veto, Russia has no say, and Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence trying to control their neighbors. I wonder whether Jens Stoltenberg has ever heard of the Monroe Doctrine or the Zimmerman Telegram, which was one of the things that led the United States into World War I against Germany. The Americans didn't take it very well when Germany was seen to be interfering in Mexican affairs. This is absolute madness that is going on here. Are these people, like the senator from Mississippi, are they disappointed that World War III never happened during the Cold War? Is that what's going on here? Now, in the Donbas, people in the Donbas are Russian speaking. And well, when we talk about the borders of the Ukraine have changed so many times and so profoundly over the last 100 years that to speak of, yes, the sanctity of Ukrainian borders is absolutely preposterous. You know, Ukraine means borderlands, and that Russia came out of Kiev and Rus. No. Russia should be allied with us. Ukraine should be allied with us, not with Russia, because that would be, Trump should have followed his instincts. He met with Putin in Helsinki. Helsinki wants peace with the West, but all of these idiots in the media and the elite were screaming that Trump was a traitor for meeting with a foreign leader. There, as in many other examples, he simply should have stuck to his guns. The government in Ukraine is bankrupt. They pretty much have to press gang people into joining their military. Which the United States, of course, is just throwing all the weaponry they can there. I don't really think that the Ukrainian army, apart from the neo-Nazi Azov brigade, say, would really be interested. I think that they would chuck down their rifles and flee as fast as they could to the West if there was ever an armed conflict, or it was believed that an armed conflict was imminent. And these are the sort of people that we're supposed to risk a World War III for. Let's go to the chat. Okay. Hello to Gamian. Let's Chokokin 666 says, let's go join up and fight against NATO. No brother war, says Gamian. Chokokin 666. Oh, Gamian says, fun fact, I was born in Donbas. Chokokin 666 has a story. A woman fell and had a grand mal seizure in the street. I'm on my hands and knees assisting her with some other passerby. Some guy shows up see above and starts yelling, "Are you diabetic?" And above says, "Is there a German compound word for the type of person who arrives long after people are assisting an injured person and decide this is their time to take command and shine?" I cleared her airway. I felt terrible for her. Reminded me of my mom. Gamian says, "What if he thought he was being stupid, would feel guilty if he didn't suggest the only thing he knew about because of the risk of appearing stupid?" Well, one of the problems that epileptics have is that, if they have a seizure despite their medicine, or they've forgotten their medicine or whatever, they find themselves on the sidewalk, say, and the common response is people thinking that they are drunk. Okay. It made him feel important, says Chogokin666. That's screaming, "Are you a diabetic?" I've seen this behavior every time I've helped some old person who fell or whatever. Hello to Anrun Red Sulfur. Gamia says, "I've yelled at bus drivers to slow down for animals in front, even like turkeys, even though I felt super conscious and embarrassed." Hello to William Hicks. Red Sulfur, migraine over Ukraine. I can't get too worked up over this. The neocons have wanted a war with Russia. They wanted, I know of this going way back. The neocons lied to us, and I believe their lies in the 70s, that the Soviet Union was doing everything that it could in order to bring about a first strike victory over the United States. Not true. In fact, yes, civil defense shelters. They're training the people. They're building these bunkers. And after Reagan was elected, see, there was a best-selling book by I think a retired British general, Hackett, his name was it called The Third World War, something like that? And so the neocons said the CIA, they can't be trusted. Well, they can't, but so the CIA is lying to us about Russia's preparations for World War III and a first strike. So Richard Pearl, the academic, a man who, let's say, hated Russia and Russians, he was given carte blanche, all the resources that he needed to do an independent, that is to say, independent of the CIA, evaluation of Soviet plans for a first strike against NATO, the United States. His team couldn't find any evidence of this whatsoever. He came back and said to the Reagan administration, they're doing it. What do you mean? You said that you can't find any evidence. The very fact that we can't find any evidence proves that this is happening. This is the insanity of the neocon mind. I've thought about the neocons for decades, and it's a mystery religion. But what is the nature of the mystery? And I concluded some years ago that it is a death cult, and I mean that sincerely. Hello to Palcaso88. Hello to Professor Paul Kakropajavaitya. Chokogan666 says Russia has subs all over the place with strategic nuclear missiles. Red Sulfur says they couldn't destroy Russia with communism. Now they're trying with neoconservatism. Ukraine is more Russian than Russia. Tell them, Professor, says De Boreas. William Hicks says, at the end of Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, the one diplomat asked the other, what was it all for? And his reply is, I wish I knew, or something along those lines. I've read Barbara Tuchman, and I don't really think that she was best placed to write a book about Germany, because she made it clear in her books that she hated Germany and hated the German people. Red Sulfur says, nice American boys should not be dying for them. And a menu. Salmon and broccoli with rice tonight, a German Pilsner, blueberry yogurt, and chamomile tea later. Dr. Deadname says the Russia-Ukraine border is of no concern to us. There was no reason for us to be involved in their dispute. Chokin666 says Russia has zero interest in invading Ukraine, but they will defend their seaports and their Russian co-ethnics. Yes, indeed, they will. Uh, Don Willis says KMG says seems agitated this evening. I'm a little agitated, I guess, because when this Ukraine business started flaring up, well, again, a few weeks ago, I thought nothing's going to come of this. Now we have people talking about nuclear war, and Joni Ernst seemingly agreeing with that idiot from the Senate in Mississippi. Freeland is insufferable. She likes to lecture people, says Dr. Deadname. I knew of her before she got into politics because she was frequently on the McLaughlin group. And I thought, why does she have this little girl voice? And if you've ever heard her, it's absolutely hilarious. She sounds like a little girl. At no point did she decide, I don't know, perhaps in her 20s, that if people are going to take me seriously, I'm going to have to do something with my voice. She also has a habit of wearing clothes, particularly skirts, which are far too short for her, particularly with her stocky frame, and far too tight, which leads to enormous hilarity when you see pictures of her walking in public. Let's see. David Wright says, look up commenter Orpheus 13 on Z-Man's essay today. His take of living in Russia now, and the mood is very informative. Hello to a moral outrage prophet. Ukraine is run by a comedian. USA is run by a medical experiment, says Red Sulfur. Hello, Crazy Frog Football Analysis. Deberea says, all this tango began with Obama threatening Putin back in 2013. Oh, yes, Twitter, and the elite, oh, horrible Vladimir Putin. Really? Is he so horrible? There's a certain class of people, which are closely related to the Neocons, who are furious with Putin solely because he crushed the oligarchs. The oligarchs, what, 6 of them are there? Sucking Russia dry. Under Yeltsin, who was a drunken buffoon, whose daughter was hoovering up tens of millions, Putin put a stop to it. Now, the oligarchs are, 5.5 out of 6 Jewish? And so this obviously meant that Putin was guilty of anti-Semitism, notwithstanding the fact that Putin enjoys very good relations with the rabbis and Jews in Russia. It's just the diaspora that has a problem with him in that regard. Again, because the oligarchs should have been allowed to strip Russia to the bone. And if you recall, let's see, 15 years ago or so, 15 to 20 years ago, the neocons and many others in the West were chortling. They were actually chortling that Russia is going to die out. Yeah, they were looking at the prospect of genocide there and laughing at it because the Russians are such horrible people. Denny McDougall says, actually, when Russia first invaded to take Crimea, the Ukrainians surrendered faster than the French against the Germans in World War II. I don't think that's fair. The French lost, 150,000 soldiers? I mean, deaths, not casualties, in the space of, a month or so? Okay, they should partition the country into Ukraine and our Ukraine. This is the suggestion made by Edward Luttwak. And it is an excellent suggestion. Excellent indeed. And it was printed in the New Republic, I believe. And it was, hang on, let me see if I can bring this up here. If it's still available. Along the lines of the Dnieper, I think. That would be the dividing line, and that would split Kiev in two, but it would mean that Western Ukraine would have a capital in Kiev, and Eastern Ukraine would have a capital in Kiev as well. Hello to Lamprey Melt. History is, Don Willis says, history is made by active, determined minorities, not by the majority, which seldom has a clear and consistent idea of what it really wants. Ted Kaczynski. Did we forget about Euromaidan and MSN fawning over beautiful young people kissing as the city square burned? What a stitch up that was. that was so obviously phony that the Ukrainians were firing on their own people. But of course, we'd been through a failed Soros-colored revolution in the Ukraine, and George Soros does not like to be disappointed. Let's see. Richard Pearl looked like a ghoul, a chubby one, but still a ghoul, says Anne Run. Hang on, I've lost that there. Love TMG, hated Eleanor over the cliff. I forget the name of the man who was from Washington State. He edited Liberty magazine, and he referred to her as the token idiot of the McLaughlin group. Of course, appearing in Liberty magazine, there was a hilarious they had these little bits at the front of the magazine. And one of them was from Jesse Walker. And it was written from the perspective of being in the future. The innocent days when Americans hadn't even heard of Andorra, let alone fear that their sons and daughters might die there. Yes, I suppose, there are Ukrainian Americans, but of course, when one talks about where do these people come from? Did they come from, Galicia? Et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the whole of the Ukraine was moved by hundreds of miles in 1945. Again, to talk about the territorial integrity of Ukraine is an absolute absurdity. Freeland is a human bobblehead, says Dan. Oh, this is from Gamian, another Z-Man commenter, quote, in many schools, what they teach is how to mount and dismount an AK-47. This is true. I did this in class aged 13 to 14. Okay, yes. There's not going to be soldiers on the ground? What, in Ukraine, American soldiers? Have you seen the look of them these days? I mean, apart from elite units like the Rangers, and of course, as been pointed out, for some time now, American military operations, it's just the elite units that take part because apparently their own commanders do not respect the infantry anymore. Oh, yes, Joe Biden said that he told Putin that he doesn't have a soul. This is early evidence of Biden's insanity. Everyone has a soul. Everyone. Perhaps, Joe Biden, who says great store by what a Catholic he is, perhaps he skipped that bit, in catechism class. Debrea says Moscow is a state of art, great quality people. Okay, let's get back to it here. Let's go to an essay which appeared in the New Criterion. And the essay is by Michael Anton, who, of course, came to be seen as a seer after a piece that he wrote before the 2016 election. And this is called Unprecedented, on the novelty of our cultural predicament. The theme is Western civilization at the crossroads. Far be it from me to doubt that the West is on the precipice of something enormous, but crossroads implies a map. Do we have one? Is a piece of paper showing the way forward, whether predictive or hopeful, even possible? I've noticed that a lot of people more or less on my side, or who see things basically as I do, are extremely confident that they know what is going to happen next. Their certainty is entirely independent of what they think they know. Some believe that the end, the collapse of present ruling arrangements, is imminent. If not tomorrow or next week, then soon, within a year or 5. Others assert that the present regime is stable and not only can, but will last for decades or even centuries. Some insist that the regime will fall of its own incompetence, others that its end will require an external push, which some are certain will come, and others are equally sure will not. Well, I'll just jump in here to say that if the United States is foolish enough to get involved militarily in Ukraine, on the ground or in the Black Sea, and it gets its ass kicked, I would say that the revolution or the collapse of the regime could follow that, or probably would follow that almost immediately. But back to Anton. When I've thought about this, I have been in some part inclined to the opinion that the present arrangements are unstable and may be approaching their end. Yet, in thinking through further, I am forced to admit that our times are marked by so many unprecedented trends and events that making predictions seems foolhardy. Before going into those differences, let's first consider the one historical parallel that all sides of the debate draw on for precedent: the rise, peak, decline, and fall of Rome. At first glance, the two cases seem to have a lot in common. Not only was the United States founded by men educated in the classics, who took Roman pseudonyms and named the government's top legislative body after Rome's, and not only did those founders revive republicanism after centuries of abeyance following the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire, but our country's history itself seems to have tracked Rome's, if not precisely, then certainly thematically. Both Rome and America were founded by kings, or in our case, under the auspices of a king. In both instances, the descendants of those kings ruled in ways their subjects found intolerable and were overthrown. Both peoples then established a mixed republican form of government with monarchical, aristocratic, and popular elements. Both of those governments were at first weighted toward their aristocratic elements, but gradually, owing in part to popular discontent and strife, became more balanced and eventually biased toward the popular element. Both societies fought constant wars, self-justified as defensive, but more often than not expansionist. Both rapidly conquered what we might call their immediate neighborhoods, the Italian peninsula and major Mediterranean islands, the North American continent, respectively, and then went on to win major wars against competing superpowers, in the process becoming world-bestriding hegemons. Indeed, we may say that no other power in history, save for perhaps the British Empire, acquired such extensive spheres of influence and so dominated their respective eras for so long. If other empires held more territory, or perhaps technically lasted longer, none exerted nearly as much enduring influence on the rest of the world. In Rome's case, its government formally made the transition from republic to empire after long expansion that bloated the treasury, increased the size and power of the military, concentrated wealth in the hands of a few who controlled not just the economy but the government, and impoverished ordinary citizens. Well, much of that may sound familiar, much is different, making the analogy, like all such historical comparisons, inexact. Rome conquered and directly administered territory throughout the entire Mediterranean basin and over most of the then known world. America's empire, by contrast, is quasi-metaphoric, or at the very least indirect. The only external territories of any consequence it controls are Puerto Rico and Guam. Then there are all the differences in religion, philosophy, society, economics, technology, and so on, far too numerous to list. America has yet formally to transform, if it ever will, from republic to empire. Yet in all important respects, America is no longer a republic, much less a democracy, but rather a kind of hybrid corporate administrative oligarchy. This lack of formal transition causes some to speculate that America is in the late Republican stage, with the Republic, it is alleged or hoped, soon to fall to a Caesar. Those who assert that the transition, however informal its appearance, has already happened, are more likely to place America in the late imperial stage, i.e., much closer to total collapse and replacement by an entirely new order. All such speculations presuppose the truth of the classical theory known as the cycle of regimes. Just as Rome was born, grew, matured, peaked, declined, and eventually fell, so will and must America. Cycle theory predicts that every more or less good regime, whether monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy, falls when it inevitably becomes overbearing and odious. Thus do monarchies degenerate into tyrannies, which are replaced by aristocracies that decay into oligarchies, which are overthrown by democracies that descend into mob rule or even anarchy. In that case, we should expect our present oligarchy sooner or later to give way to democracy. While that possibility cannot be dismissed out of hand, Anton continues, the prospect seems laughable. If there is to be, as cycle theory predicts, a popular revolt against our corrupt oligarchy, it would seem much more likely to be led by a charismatic, centralizing figure who ascends to the leadership of the popular party and then installs himself as the head of government. In other words, Caesarism. And even that would depend on a Caesar of sufficient talent and institutional support, as well as a sufficient level of spirit and virtue in the people, and on much else beside. More fundamentally, classic cycle theory presupposes an ethnically, linguistically, and religiously unified people. Indeed, in his Politics, Aristotle says that, quote, dissimilarity of stock is conducive to factional conflict, unquote, i.e., ethnic differences in and of themselves, irrespective of disagreements over regime form, can drive revolution. Aristotle seems to admit the possibility of assimilation. Dissimilarity, he says, leads to conflict until a cooperative spirit develops. But he cites no examples, forcing one to wonder how likely it is for this theoretical possibility to be actualized in the real world. It seems instead that the fundamental conflict between the few and the many emerges only where the more fundamental conflict between differing peoples is absent. Where it is not, the few and the many alike rally to their fellow ethnics. Ethnicity itself, rather than class, is their prime motivator. Multi-ethnic polities are hardly unknown to history. Of these, Aristotle gives several examples, all of which ended up fighting civil wars along ethnic lines. The most common, one may say only, way that multi-ethnic societies have been successfully governed is centrally from the top by some form of one-man rule, whether monarchical, Caesarist, or tyrannical. This ultimately is how Rome solved the problem of admitting so many foreigners to citizenship, to say nothing of its far-flung conquest of peoples whom it never made citizens. In more recent times, one may think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Tito's Yugoslavia. Consider now the contemporary United States of America. At first glance, it seems to belie Aristotle's implied assertion that regime-ending ethnic conflict is unavoidable wherever more than one group lives under the same government. Americans pride themselves and their country on their exceptional track record of assimilating people from all over the world. Yet, before Americans congratulate themselves overmuch, they should reflect first on the fact that the United States has not merely abandoned, but utterly repudiated the traditional understanding of assimilation, which is now denounced by all elite opinion as racist and evil. Not only does no American institution encourage, much less demand, assimilation, they all foment the opposite. Immigrants to America are exhorted to embrace their native cultures and taught that the country to which they've chosen to immigrate is the worst in world history, whose people and institutions are intent on harming them, and that their own cultures are infinitely superior. In this respect, one supposes immigrants are encouraged to assimilate to the anti-Americanism of the average Oberlin professor. Be that as it may, no nation in recorded history has ever willingly opened its doors to millions of immigrants, only to insist that they must never adapt to the traditional ways of their new country, indeed insisting that they forever remain as foreign as the day they arrived. Similarly, no country in recorded history has ever welcomed millions with the message that their new country, along with its existing citizens, are inherently evil and out to get them. Second, assimilation works best among people with some common underlying similarity, whether political, linguistic, ethnic, religious, or cultural, preferably a combination of all these. Its effectiveness declines as the differences among the disparate peoples increase. Historically, the closer in the above categories an immigrant group was to founding stock Americans, the more quickly and smoothly its members assimilated. American immigration policy and practice has drifted steadily away from prioritizing this practice, in particular since the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act and the de facto, since the 1970s at least, non-enforcement of American borders and immigration laws. Newcomers to America have become more and more distant, not just from existing Americans, but from one another. America now takes in and has been importing for more than 50 years people from every part of the globe, of every faith, speaking every language. This, too, has never happened before in world history. Third is the size of the wave. Precise numbers are hard to come by, but if we count immigrants, legal and illegal, plus all their direct descendants, then something like 100 million newcomers have arrived in America since 1965. Only 14 countries today have total populations exceeding that figure. In 1965, there were just under 200 million Americans. Today, it is estimated that 333 million live within America's borders. At least two-thirds of that growth has been immigrant-driven. This large a migration wave in so short a time to one country from so many different sources has also never happened before in human history. Need a respectable source to vouch for that? Here's Bill Clinton in 1998. Quote, "But now we are being tested again by a new wave of immigration larger than any in a century, far more diverse than any in our history. Each year, nearly 1 million people come legally to America. Today, nearly 1 in 10 people in America was born in another country. 1 in 5 school children are from immigrant families. Today, largely because of immigration, there is no majority race in Hawaii or Houston or New York City. Within 5 years, there will be no majority race in our largest state, California. In a little more than 50 years, there will be no majority race in the United States." And here he was interrupted by applause. No other nation in history has gone through demographic change of this magnitude in so short a time. Anton comments, note the applause. The venue of the above speech was a university commencement, a sitting president addressing freshly minted college graduates and their parents, i.e. the elite speaking to the elite. Demographic decline was literally applauded, and this is only one example. Mere months ago, when the census announced that for the first time in American history, the white population had declined in absolute numbers, the Tonight Show's audience cheered. No native-born population of any country has ever literally cheered its own dispossession. The Great Replacement is happening not just in America, but throughout the West. Elites both deny and affirm it. When they write op-eds in the New York Times entitled, "We can replace them," that's a good thing. And the phenomenon under discussion is absolutely right and just. When you notice and express the mildest wish not to be replaced, it's a racist conspiracy theory that you are evil for even mentioning it. Your evil being further proof that you deserve to be replaced. They get to say it. You're required not merely to pretend that you didn't hear it, but also to insist that they never said it. No majority stock in any nation has ever deliberately sought its own replacement, much less insisted that those who might have misgivings lie to themselves that it's not happening. The Great Replacement is not just happening under the Biden-Harris regime, it is accelerating. Among the few promises Biden has kept are those not to build a single new inch of the border wall or to enforce immigration laws. As a result, illegal migrants are pouring across the southern border at an unprecedented rate. The ridiculous former practice of catch and release, catch an illegal immigrant, release him on American soil, has been replaced by catch and bus, or even catch and airlift. The U.S. government places illegal border crossers on buses and planes and distributes them throughout the heartland unannounced, often followed by official denials. Naturally, none of these people is vetted in any way, not for COVID, which has the rest of us in semi-permanent lockdown, nor for criminal records or anything else. Couple this with the regime's policy to settle throughout Middle America as many unvetted Afghans as possible, some of whom are likely terrorists, several of whom have already committed sex crimes, and it is fair to describe current practice as demographic warfare. The concept is not exactly new. Tyrants have been known from time immemorial to move populations around so as to hold conquests more securely. What's unprecedented is a regime importing foreigners to harm its own people. I'll just break in here to say that if you've ever seen Martin Scorsese's film Kundun about the Dalai Lama, you will see a meeting between Mao Zedong and the Dalai Lama. And there had been uprisings in Tibet against the Chinese occupation, which took place in 1950. They weren't very successful. And Mao Zedong laughs at the Dalai Lama and says, "We're going to replace you. We are going to replace you with Han Chinese." Only the strange thing is when this is repeated in America and Canada and Britain, no, we're not going to replace, a recalcitrant conquest with our own people. We're going to replace our own people with foreigners, hostile foreigners. Now, just think about how strange that is, how bizarre that is, how barely believable that is. But that is elite opinion. And one will be excoriated, to say the least, if one even notices it, let alone speaks out against it. But back to Michael Anton. The question of immigration is inseparable from that of race. Critical race theory, much in the news lately, is but the latest iteration of intellectual and academic anti-whiteness that has been central to leftist ideology since the mid-1960s. The specimen is Susan Sontag's 1967 belch that, quote, "the white race is the cancer of human history," unquote. Examples are so numerous today that cataloging them all would be a full-time job for an entire think tank, but a pointless one, since the left will in the same breath deny and affirm their own words quoted back to them. We didn't say that, and it's good that we did. Many whites apparently believe they deserve to be replaced because their race makes them uniquely and irredeemably evil. While cultural self-loathing is hardly unknown to history, I know of none so explicitly race-based or widespread or so eager to pursue self-abnegation all the way to the end. This hatred of the core stock of the nation by other members of that same stock also appears to be unprecedented. Examples can be found of a new elite rising to preeminence above an older one, which it then displaces with prejudice, but of a ruling class coming to despise its own, broadly speaking, ethnic group and seeking ways to rob their fellow co-ethnics of power, standing, and influence, I can't think of any such other cases. The matter becomes even more complicated when one reflects that this is mostly an intra-white civil war. One group of whites pronounces the entire white race evil, seeks policies to hurt it, but somehow exempts itself. So far, these upper-class whites have found ways to protect their own privilege, but haven't developed consistent rhetoric to defend that privilege. They appear to believe that no matter how much anti-white poison they vomit, or how many destructive policies they enact, none will ever blow back on them. In particular, they seem to believe that the allies in whom they stir up anti-white hatred will never turn and bite them. At least they appear not to have seriously considered the possibility. This situation, too, is unprecedented. Michael Anton continues, tyrants or ruling classes that despoil their countries for personal gain are nothing new. If that were all we had today, our situation would be much more understandable. And we do in part have that. Our ruling class is rich and rapacious, rich because rapacious, and eager to be richer still by taking what little you have left. Yet elite enthusiasms extend well beyond mere greed. There is a malice in them atypical to the native despot, one found historically only or largely among the most punitive conquerors. A tyrant fears a healthy population, to be sure, but such is always a threat to his power. This fear typically inspires little beyond efforts to ensure that the population is dependent and unarmed. Two aims of our overlords, it need hardly be added. But our elites also go much further. They seem determined to make the American population fat, weak, ugly, lethargic, drug-addled, screen-addicted, and hypersexualized. The men effeminate and the women masculine. Those last two barely scratch the surface of the agenda, which includes turning males into females and vice versa, or into any one of a potentially infinite number of genders. The number varies depending on which source you check. 63 is the highest I could find. Needless to say, no establishment source stops at 2. The regime promotes every imaginable historic form of degeneracy and then invents new ones undreamt of by Caligula the Borgias or Catherine the Great. All these it pushes through every available media channel, social and legacy, in programming and advertising alike, even in books stocked in elementary school libraries. As I write, the Virginia governor's race is being roiled by the presence in said libraries of Genderqueer, a memoir, an illustrated so-called children's book as sexually explicit as 1970s hardcore pornography, and arguably illegal to boot since it depicts minors. One candidate for governor and his supporters indignantly insist that this kind of material must be forced on your kids at public expense and that only Nazis object. Degeneracy in tyrants is, of course, as old as the hills, but prior despots had the decency, if one could call it that, to restrict their perversions to the satisfaction of their own private pleasures. To force degeneracy on the whole of society with the explicit intent of bringing the rest of us to our knees, literally and figuratively, that, I think, has never happened before. An odd feature of our time is the coupling of mass hypersexualization with mass barrenness. Some argue, plausibly, that the link is direct. Hypersexualization disconnected from procreation inevitably leads to fewer babies. The degree to which crashing fertility is simply an effect of modernity versus a deliberate plan by our rulers is an open question. It is certainly true that every economically and technologically developed society, regardless of region, culture, race, or religion, suffers from cratering birth rates. Michael Anton continues, but it's also true that our rulers advocate and celebrate careerism, consumerism, self-centeredness, casual sex, delayed marriage, let us say non-fecund couplings, and where and if that all fails, small families for the environment, you understand. In other words, when and where the allegedly inexorable process of modernity is overcome by the innate human desire for love and family, the regime eagerly steps in with propaganda to bully men and women out of such longings. I suppose there is a near historical precedent for this, namely China's one-child policy, in effect from 1980 to 2015. But that was implemented to relieve, it was thought, a looming Malthusian crisis, a fear that cannot reasonably apply to contemporary America, whose birth rate is 1.64 and falling like a stone. China itself, whose leaders want its people to live on, abandoned the policy. Meanwhile, America unofficially does everything it can to suppress native births. Has this ever happened before in a country not even plausibly facing a population crisis? The promotion of ugliness deserves special attention. The autocrats of old wanted to be known for their patronage of beauty, the arts, and great works. This is one meaning of Shelley's Ozymandias and also of Augustus's boast that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, to say nothing of him having commissioned the Aeneid. A stroll through any city in Europe and in most of the Americas finds the same sentiment everywhere. Until about the middle of the 20th century, when suddenly everything turned brutalist and brutally ugly, and not just the buildings, but the art, the literature, the music, almost everything. One attempts to state the following as delicately as possible, even though regime propaganda on this score is anything but delicate. But today, the ugliness extends to people. One hesitates also to say anything that could be interpreted as praise of underwear ads, but within living memory, the sirens of Times Square billboards were lithe and lovely. Today, they are quite deliberately obese and angry. That is, when they're not cross-dressers or pierced like an East Village junkie and tattooed like a C-list porn star. All this, we are commanded to believe, is beautiful, though no healthy person does. The point seems to be humiliation, forcing us little people to say the thing which is not. That trick is also as old as the hills, but the deliberate promotion of ugliness seems to be a new way to play it. Antiquity abounded in wicked tyrants, yet try to find an ancient statue anywhere near as hideous as a modern lingerie model. Michael Anton continues, but in terms of what we choose to elevate, nothing illustrates the perversity of present of America more than the deification of George Floyd. There are now monuments to him all over the country that are treated as sacred. In a rare instance, when one is defaced, the resultant outcry resembles the Athenian people's reaction to the desecration of the Hermae. One may insist that George Floyd did not deserve to die the way he did, and still see that neither did he live his life so as to make the possibility remote. He was convicted of 8 crimes and charged with or detained with at least 19, although one must here concede the difficulty of finding reliable, relevant information, since unflattering facts about Floyd's life are effectively suppressed and are taboo to discuss. The worst of his crimes was an armed robbery in which he pointed a gun at the belly of a woman who may or may not have been pregnant. Floyd's admirers insist she wasn't, but more careful sources assert only that no one has ever definitively proved she was. Floyd was the father of 5 children, from whose lives he was by all accounts absent, and none of whose mothers he ever married. At the time of his death, Floyd was in the process of being arrested for yet another crime and was not cooperating with the arresting officers. A serial drug abuser, he had in his system not just methamphetamine, but a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl, an extremely dangerous synthetic opioid, which may well have contributed to his death. Even if one fully accepts the trial court's finding that the drugs played no role, one must still admit that had Floyd only gotten into the back of the police vehicle as officers instructed, he could not have died in the way prosecutors and the media alleged. Above all, we must confront the painful fact that Floyd did not, according to moral standards that for centuries were taken for granted, live a life worthy of admiration, much less of veneration. Yet our society treats him as a saint, if not something higher. The pagan gods were not always well behaved, to say the least, but has any people ever chosen such an undeserving object of worship? More from Michael Anton. We may tie these points together under the broad rubric of education, though that word is risibly inapt to what is taught today. The word's root is Latin and means to lead forth, that is, to coax out of imperfect but improvable human nature that which makes each human being better, or as the classics understood it, not merely to impart knowledge, but also to form character. In both respects, our system does the opposite. It teaches lies, attacks and suppresses truth, and encourages people to behave worse. It tells children to hate themselves or their classmates because of their race and to hate their country. It encourages boys to declare themselves girls and vice versa. It badgers kids into professing themselves attracted to members of the same sex or of all 63 sexes, regardless of or despite their natural inclination. It fire hoses them with sexualized messaging and imagery, always taking care to decouple orgasmic self-indulgence from love and family. The people who run the system, or many of them, can be described only as sadists. How sick does one mind have to be to think it is a good idea to teach a black kindergartner, through the taxpayer-financed public education system no less, to hate his white classmates, or those white classmates to hate themselves? A sane society would call this child abuse. The system now protects predators at the expense of the vulnerable and attacks parents who object. In Virginia, a boy in a skirt entered a girl's bathroom and raped a student. The school and the district hushed it up and transferred him to another school where he did it again. When one victim's father complained at a school board meeting, cops roughed him up and arrested him. The superintendent, principal, and all others in authority furiously denied that any assault had ever taken place. That is, except for the father's impassioned plea, which the school board referred to the Attorney General of the United States, who then ordered the FBI and U.S. attorneys to investigate outspoken parents as, quote, domestic terrorists. This is not merely insane, but deliberately evil. The Carthaginians cast living children into furnaces to satiate their false god Baal. We sacrifice our children's mental health and adult futures to appease our false god Woki. Plus ça change? We may note in passing that when similar atrocities occurred in the pre-woke Catholic Church, an institution the ruling class feared and despised, demands for accountability were deafening. Today, the only sounds one hears are from establishmentarians and their conservatism Inc. enablers. This isn't happening. It's a culture war trope, ginned up by MAGA racists. And anyway, it's no big deal, so lighten up. The most prevalent failures of education in history, it is widely accepted, have stemmed from a lack of it, failing to teach the poor basic skills such as reading and writing, or even deliberately depriving them of such learning. Now we have come full circle, but worse. We barely teach kids to read, write, or add anymore. Indeed, the most progressive corners of the education system denounce such emphasis on standards and core knowledge as white supremacist. There's ample historical precedent for widespread illiteracy, but for teaching one's own citizens self-hatred, degeneracy, and despondency without teaching them to read and write? Michael Anton continues, the typical tyrant enjoys wealth and power, which are easier to extract from a productive populace than from zombies. He therefore typically does not prioritize degrading his population beyond measures necessary to produce obedience. The serial humiliations inflicted on America's people by its ruling class, not all of which, to say the least, generate profits, appear to be another element of contemporary life without historical precedent. Crime is a case in point. No society, whether free or despotic, benefits from crime, all else being equal, though it's certainly true that a tyrant can find it useful to exempt his own partisans from criminal enforcement, and even to encourage them to terrorize his enemies. Criminals being criminals, this is a hard dynamic to keep from spinning out of control. In 2020, for instance, the ruling class unleashed BLM hordes and Antifa predators, plus assorted rioters and looters to despoil and burn some 220 American cities. Sacking was not uncommon in the ancient world. Rome was sacked many times, but always by foreigners, and never at the instigation of her leading citizens. The Senate never riled up the plebs to scorch the Capitoline. Yet in the summer of 2020, America's ruling class actively encouraged through state-aligned media the repeated sacking of Manhattan, the very beating heart of the Davos archipelago, where our richest and most powerful overlords live and work. They fired up mobs to trash huge swaths of Washington, D.C., their cherished imperial capital, which to this day has yet to recover. Why did they do that? Was there some nefarious plan to derive benefit that I don't understand, or was this an instance of losing control of these shock troops? Either way, the events were unprecedented. Then there are the related issues of technology and our fake economy. These subjects are far too large to explore here and so must be treated cursorily. Let us merely say that modern digital technology is unlike any previous advance in human history. It threatens not only to become man master and destroyer, other technologies have also threatened that, but also to remake his very soul or kill it. The modern economy that technology enables is similarly anti-human. It deprives billions of the dignity of meaningful work at fair remuneration, while it enriches a tiny minority adept at manipulating bits and bytes to no discernible purpose or benefit. The world has had to endure oligarchs for millennia, but our empty plutocrats create nothing but new ways to waste time and enervate the spirit. They are, like the technologies that make them rich and powerful, an entirely new phenomenon. Finally, there is the endless insistence that every new dawn must begin a fresh year zero. We must start continually anew. What was acceptable yesterday is anathema today and will be more so tomorrow. All that came before must be swept aside and destroyed with extreme prejudice on a rolling basis. The most ferocious revolutionaries of yesteryear didn't do this. The Jacobins changed the calendar and guillotined a lot of nobles, but otherwise allowed France to remain French. The Bolsheviks did not touch the Russian literary or concert canons. To the contrary, they celebrated both. Mao made an attempt to start over until the more sensible party bosses realized that the old man, and especially his wife, had lost their minds and were destroying China, sidelined him, and quietly put an end to the Cultural Revolution 4 years before formally declaring mission accomplished. The Ayatollah did not ban Nowruz or other cornerstones of Persian tradition beloved by the Iranian people, but which predated his puritanical version of Islam. Our overlords, by contrast, insist on changing everything and will not stop until everything familiar is gone. When this is pointed out, they smirk about the slippery slope fallacy and gleefully lie. That will never happen, they say, until they insist on it, and once accomplished, move on to the next target. They are cultural locusts devouring everything in their path. If the internal logic, if one may use that word in this context, of their passionate hatred is allowed to play out, no statue can be left standing, no traditional holiday observed, no name unchanged. If that outcome does not come to pass, it will not be because those driving toward it have had a change of heart, nor is it likely to because the right suddenly becomes effective in opposition. It will rather be because the locusts destroy too many of the country's remaining functional parts too soon, causing the system to collapse before their program is complete, thereby making further progress impossible. Any one of the above elements would appear to be unprecedented. Just a few of them in combination surely are. All of them together? How, therefore, can anyone be confident that he knows what is going to happen, whether imminent collapse, drawn-out decline, or centuries of tyranny? And Michael Anton concludes, if forced to bet, I would have to place my chips somewhere between imminent collapse and drawn-out decline. I occasionally read theories of triple bank shots and four-dimensional chess. They really know what they're doing, only to marvel. Our regime cannot at present unload a cargo ship, stock a store shelf, run a clean election, handle parental complaints at a school board meeting, pass a budget bill, treat a cold variant, keep order in the streets, defeat a third world country, or even evacuate said country cleanly. And that's to say nothing of all the things it should be doing that all non-joke countries do that it refuses to do. If our ruling class has a plan, it would seem to be to destroy the society and institutions for which they, at present, are the largest, one is to say the only beneficiaries. Do they think they can benefit more from the wreckage, or are they driven by hatreds that blind them to self-interest? Perhaps they're simply insane. Whatever the case, couple all this unprecedentedness with all this incompetence, and going long on woke America seems a sucker bet. But to end where we began, the very unprecedentedness of our situation means that all bets are off. And this is Michael Anton, an essay called Unprecedented, which is the cover story of the December 2021 issue of the New Criterion. Let's go to the chat. This is a very long essay, and I read all of it with a few omissions because I think that it is terribly important and is the best summary of the state, well, America is in, but also the state generally of all, certainly Anglosphere cultures, certainly of my own country. Let's scroll up and find out what's been going on in the chat. Okay, I have to scroll up higher. Jonathan Paul says, my sister-in-law lives in Moscow. She was widowed last month when her husband died of epilepsy. Anron says, I'd like a remake of The Mouse That Roared, the time a small country actually defeats the U.S. military. Now, that's an interesting question that you brought up. Since Vietnam, the United States has, refused, really, to wage an all-out campaign against a country that was in position to fight back or was willing to fight back. The War of Clinton's Pants in 1999, as I called it, against Serbia. Serbia had the means to fight back, but decided for various reasons not to. I have it on very good authority that a plan was presented to the Serbian leadership whereby they would seize an American airbase in the region and take all of the soldiers hostage. And at the very last minute, it was decided not to do that. Okay, Trudeau is the first American royal lapdog. LOL, says de Boreas. GSP, hello. After the 2020 election, belief or trust in American democracy has, I believe, dropped sharply amongst Americans and Westerners. Elites will rely more on authoritarian measures. Don Willis says, we did that play in college with some embellishments. Tee-hee. My brothers were drunk most rehearsals. Okay. Anren says, I've actually only seen parts of the movie version with Peter Sellers. I believe that movie was so popular that they made a sequel to it. GSP says you can democratically win an election, but if your country doesn't have trans kids and gay marriage, then to our elites, that country is not a democracy. Well, yes. Yes, democracy means that the good guys always win. And the good guys are the people who are in favor of the sexual mutilation of as many children as possible. To give just one example, Don Willis says entitled soccer mommies are still a threat to freedom. Do not be deceived. Ashyman Bravo says Luke Ford was saying that people who watch live streams substitute real relationships with parasocial relationships. Is he not doing live streams anymore or just recorded bits? I don't really keep up with him, although a couple of weeks ago, someone said that he had moved to Australia, and I looked at a couple of videos that he had. I guess it would be difficult doing a live stream from Australia, right? Because of the time difference. That could be the reason. But, I mean, he was doing live streams for so many years. Is the essential fungibility of people the root principle of a modern American government, says Hauper. Well, but people aren't fungible in that way. I mean, the people who have been coming over the Mexican border, first Mexicans, but then Central Americans and now Haitians and people from all over the world, including, the Congo, say, they're not really fungible in the sense that they are not capable of contributing very much. Okay, how many dishwashers does America need? Okay. A good or bad democracy delivered the most prosperous and peaceful 75 years in human history, says de Boreas. Okay. I don't know. I mean, I really disdain evaluations of human happiness that are entirely materialistic. The Great Replacement is a conspiracy theory unless you think it's positive, says GSP. Yes. Jokin 666 says, I loved Kundan. Yo Mama says, so basically we are ruled by psychopaths. Russia feared an 85% white America, but they don't fear a Brazilian America, says GSP. Hello to Oscar Toe and Joel Agerke. I have no mouth and I must scream, the nation, says Yo Mama. Now, who was it? Harlan Ellison. That's something that he wrote, right? Enron has a pro tip. Don't order tacos from a pizza joint, even if you like their pizza. Not too good tonight. I like Kevin's tie. It's festive, says Oscar Toe. Interestingly, China exempted Tibet from following the one baby policy. Well, says GSP, I suppose that had to. The reason for that is that they were determined, to fill up the country with Han Chinese. So, you need babies. Yoam says, hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.4 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. Okay. Ashimane Bravo says, also based Polish and Ukrainian ultranationalism is funded by the U.S. global deep state as a buffer against Russia. George Soros literally funds Ukrainian nationalists. Yes, they call good money after bad. Stepan Bandera. You ever heard of Stepan Bandera or Stefan Bandera? The complicated character, to be sure, but there are people in the Ukraine and in the Ukrainian diaspora who worship him almost as a god. Remember, the Beastie Boys all tried to free Tibet and then they just gave up carrying, says Oscar Toe. Yes, I did notice that. Hello to Sheila Carter and Octavia Stewart. Okay. The Dalai Lama must have gave Richard Gere so much spiritual power that he disappeared and stopped caring about worldly cares. That's Oscar Toe. Okay. No Sleep Till Breezewood says, remember, as bad as things are, our church attendance is still higher than the countries we think we have it better than. That's true. It's true. The problem with that analysis is that let's say evangelical Christianity in the United States is overwhelmingly a health and happiness cult. As for the so-called mainline religions, God knows what they're on about. It certainly isn't God. As for the Catholic Church, there are still elements of resistance to modernity there, but in the main, it's been taken over by people who worship a vaccine now. They certainly don't worship God. I seem to recall that churches just rolled over for some virus, so I'm not putting any faith on them keeping the devil away, says Oscar Toe. Don Willis says, don't look to churches, don't look to men, look to God, keep the faith. Have you heard, Ashiman Bravo says, have you heard of the 2020 Amazon Prime TV series Utopia? No, I'm not familiar with it. Luke Ford making excuses for his germophobia, burning his old fan base, is no sleep. Jaakko Raipala, our Finnish friend, says maybe free market democracy needed communism as an opponent to produce the high trust societies that we had. After the theoretical threat of revolution went away, we just turned into plutocracies. I think that there's something to that. I think that the binary world, you remember after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is only one hyperpower in the world, the United States. Well, as much as I hated the Soviet Union, and my Cold War credentials are impeccable, all this talk about a single hyperpower in the world distressed and frightened me. As soon as the old crazy branch Davidians have had enough supplies for themselves and foodstuffs to be apart from most in town, I watched this on television, when they use banned weapons to kill women and children, to gas them to death. And people like Oliver North, of course they had to do that. They could have brought in David Koresh at any time. He was very friendly with the local law enforcement. They could have, said, hey, come on, the sheriff wants to talk to you. But no, Janet Reno had to prove just how masculine she was. Okay. Oh, yes. what was it? I was looking at the district attorney of Philadelphia saying, "What's all this talk about a crime wave? There's no crime wave. It's all made up." What's definitely not made up is that he's one of the DAs who George Soros paid to be in office. This is from Bill Hutchinson at ABC News. It's just crazy. 12 major cities hit all-time homicide records. Now, keep in mind that it's a lot harder to kill people now than it was even 10 or 20 years ago because of advances in EMT technology driven by the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. At least 12 major U.S. cities have broken annual homicide records in 2021, and there's still 3 weeks to go in the year. Of the dozen cities that have already surpassed the grim milestones for killings, 5 top records that were set or tied just last year. It's terrible to every morning get up and have to go look at the numbers and look at the news and see the stories. It's just crazy. It's just crazy, and this needs to stop, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney said after his city surpassed its annual homicide record of 500, which had stood since 1990. Well, it's not as if the mayor of Philadelphia can do anything, right? Philadelphia, a city of roughly 1.5 million, has had more homicides this year than the nation's 2 largest cities, New York and Los Angeles. How about that? What are the 12 cities that have broken annual homicide records? Portland, Indianapolis, Toledo, St. Paul, Minnesota, Rochester, Philadelphia, Louisville, Tucson, Albuquerque, Columbus, Ohio, Baton Rouge, and Austin. From coast to coast and from north to south. And let's, oh yes, I just wanted to mention this briefly. This is from Rorat Kaylee. It's a Catholic site, a traditionalist Catholic site. Major interview by Henry Sire, author of The Dictator Pope. Essentially, the problem is that Bergoglio has no real principles like the typical Peronist that he is. The media has been not keen to point out anti-Pope Francis's great love for Juan Perón and the political movement that he founded. Juan Perón, if any, to the extent that it's possible for any one man to destroy a country, Juan Perón destroyed Argentina. Do you know that in 1900, Argentina was on a per capita basis richer than England? Yeah, how about that, eh? Henry Sire, the historian and former member of the Order of Malta, illegally expelled for his research work on Francis, is well known and well regarded by Orthodox Catholics worldwide for his great book on Jorge Mario Bergoglio, The Dictator Pope. So he gave an interview to Gloria.tv, which has been, I should mention, this is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. So this has been transcribed. And it's at RORATE-CAELI.blogspot.com. The Dictator Pope came out in 2017, making considerable waves. What is the specific contribution of this book? For the most part, The Dictator Pope was little more than a roundup of the work that many journalists had already done, analyzing the abuses and blunders of Francis's rule. My main contribution was that I was able to use the insights of Argentinians who knew exactly what Bergoglio was like, insights which, owing to the language barrier, had not been made known in the English-speaking world. Looking back, what would you write differently? In fact, further research has shown me that I underestimated the morass of corruption to which Bergoglio belonged to during his Argentinian career. An example was his role as a protector of clerical sexual abusers. I greatly regret that I had not fuller facts at my disposal so as to present a true picture of the man whom the cardinals elected Pope in 2013. For instance, when I wrote my book, I was not fully aware of the culture of moral and financial corruption in which the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires was immersed. For that culture, Bergoglio was not himself responsible, but he did nothing to reform it, and he bolstered it by his policy of cover-up. There are also aspects of Bergoglio's early career which only an Argentinian researcher could fully explore, especially the controversial question of his behavior during the military dictatorship. Your book contains a chapter about the Sankt Gallen or St. Gallen Mafia. However, even without this group, was it not just a question of time until a Francis could be elected Pope, given the fact that in the decades before Francis, most bishops and cardinals were chosen from the conformist liberal group? Sire answers, it's certainly true that neither John Paul II nor Benedict did much to keep modernists out of the College of Cardinals. Given the low standard of the modern hierarchy, the chances of a bad Pope being elected were real. Yes, both John Paul II, who was, to my mind, the worst Pope since the Counter-Reformation, since to be surpassed, of course, by anti-Pope Francis, and Benedict, they had this strange policy that I'm not going to appoint, my people or people I believe to be my people as bishops and as cardinals. Let's try to be fair. 50% of good people and 50% of terrible people. How do they think this was going to work out? But let's go back to Juan Perón. And in Argentina, Bergoglio, Sire says, is a classic product of Argentinian society, which is a caricature of Spanish society with special elements such as Peronism added. Essentially, those who try to understand Bergoglio from the standards of Anglo-Saxon or Germanic decency and correct conduct find themselves struggling to grasp the culture of unprincipled selfishness, which for an Argentinian is just part of the climate. Question: among the Jesuits in Argentina, Bergoglio was considered a conservative. He owed his career to conservatives. He had no support from his order. What went wrong? You touch on the great mystery of Bergoglio's career, his transition from the right-hand man of the reactionary, Cardinal Quaracino in Buenos Aires, to the favorite of the Sankt Gallen group. The only explanation I can see that is in the declining years of Pope John Paul II, it was expected that a more liberal pope would succeed him, and Bergoglio wanted to be on the winning side. I don't think he seriously expected to be the papal candidate himself before 2005. But essentially the problem with Bergoglio is that he has no real principles like the typical Peronist that he is. Peronists are just opportunists. In recent history, how many priests have been named bishops for their unwavering fidelity to the faith? Isn't opportunism the first requirement for those who want to climb the career ladder in the church? Sire responds, there are some exceptions, Cardinals Sarah and Burke, for example. But what distinguishes Bergoglio is that opportunism is part of an elaborate political culture in which he was brought up, and the basis for a cunning and manipulative career in which most bishops don't match him. Yes. Francis loves to hide behind contradictions, for instance, calling abortion a hit job, and by calling the abortionist Emma Bonino one of the great Italians. What tactic is behind this? This, again, is typical Peronism, throwing out contradictory signals to opposite parties. An Argentinian would understand it perfectly well. To the rest of the world, it appears incomprehensible. Apart from Peron, does Francis not know St. Paul's, your word be yes, yes or no? No? All through his life, Bergoglio's yes has been no, and his no has been yes. Let's check in on Bruce Arthur, who I talked about yesterday, former jock sniffer, now coronavirus panic expert at the Toronto Star. And I said on Twitter today that soon enough, this fellow is going to be howling at the moon. He has completely lost it. Completely lost it. He's just going to scream as loud as he can. And it's all coming to an end. It's all coming to an end, because, well, here's an example. He retweeted a cartoon by the Toronto Star's columnist, where there's a meteor about to crush some Doug Ford supporter who's fat and has a ball cap, and he's throwing away his mask. Things are returning to normal, and the meteor is labeled new variant. And Bruce Arthur's response is, yeah, he typed that out. I hope we keep schools open, but everything else should be on the table. Now, He's also talking about Omicron's coming. Delta's doing well. The science table shows that even optimistic scenarios could cancel surgeries, and the province isn't doing anything. Not true, but it's not doing much. Boosters, boosters, boosters. It's time for a significant escalation in urgency on boosters now. Oh, check out the ICU by Unvaxxed and Vaxxed. Rob Ferguson sent this to him. I cited this. It's stunningly clear. If everybody eligible was vaccinated, we would have a much easier path preparing for Omicron. You see the planted axiom there that Omicron is going to be just worse? Because of course it's going to be worse. He's talking about what, leaf blowers or something like this to spread the vaccine. Yeah, he's actually doing that. Oh, here we go. Exact. It's not enough. Of course, it's never enough. Our capacity is theoretically 100,000 per day, way below what we were doing in the summer. We need to pull out the stops. NACI, PHAC, PHUs, the province, everyone, messaging, urgency, more mandates, better passports, and boosters fired from leaf blowers. Go time. That's an exact quotation. I just, I imagine Bruce Arthur in his lair, typing away. Cases, 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 COVID cases, cases, Omicron, 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 vaccines, boosters, boosters, boosters. And then there's a hammering at the door. So, who is it? Who is it? What do you want? We're here to help you, Mr. Arthur. Would you please open the door? You can see that we're triple masked and we have the visors too. We're here to help you. So he opens the door and three men come in. And the leading man says, you see these two men here dressed in white? They're here to help you, Mr. Arthur. You haven't been well of late. No, that this is true. It's true. I haven't, but the news, cases, 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 cases. Well, we're going to take you to a place where you'll be all alone, a place where you won't have to worry about other people infecting you, a place where you can't harm yourself, a place without the internet. All there be is hockey highlights. You like hockey highlights, don't you, Mr. Arthur? Hockey, hockey, hockey. Yeah. I love hockey, hockey, hockey. Okay. Then he says to the man in the white coats, okay, Thorazine. Yeah. What? 50, let's say 100 cc's of Thorazine. I mean, I really think it might come to that. It might just come to that. Oh, and let's look at the latest numbers from Bruce Arthur's province of Ontario. This is from Carissa Wilson at CP24. Ontario reported more than 1,000 new COVID-19 cases and 8 more virus-related deaths on Wednesday, as the 7-day rolling average of new infections hit a high not seen in over 6 months. But the number of vaccinated keeps getting higher and higher and higher. Why is this happening? Of the latest cases, 421 people are unvaccinated, 22 are partially vaccinated, 502 are fully vaccinated, and 64 have an unknown vaccination status. I predicted this on this show, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and of course, maybe a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but of course, our physiology here in Ontario, in Canada, is the same as, Israel, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. So it happened there. And of course, it's going to happen here. To date, over 85% of Ontarians aged 5 and older have received at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, and more than 80% have received 2 doses and are considered fully vaccinated. How about that, eh? Considered fully vaccinated for now. But that's going to change, and we know that. Okay, let me open up a few stories here. From Breitbart, Pam Key, National Institute of Allergy, we know who Dr. Fauci is, said Wednesday on CNN that it was a matter of when, not if, when, not if, the definition of fully vaccinated will change to include a third booster shot. And as already predicted here in this space, you know what's going to happen. They're going to goose the numbers. Oh, well, yeah, but these people who are coming down with the new cases, the people who are hospitalized in ICUs, the people who are dead, they weren't fully vaccinated. But first you told us that one dose was enough. Did we? I don't remember that. Then you told us that 2 doses was fully vaccinated. I especially don't remember that. Now you're telling us that you need 3 doses to be fully vaccinated. Well, we are telling you that for the moment. That could change. But remember, however it changes, it was science then, and it's science now. This is from Rosella Turkatan at the Jerusalem Post. Israel to consider 4th vaccine for immunosuppressed patients. There's a piece at LouRockwell.com. And it's by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I highly recommend it to you because, you know, I lived through this. I was in the media at the time, and it was a crime. And the man responsible for this crime was not punished. America's bought, brain-dead, and blinded mainstream media is lambasting Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, for his observation that Dr. Anthony Fauci overhyped the danger of HIV during the 1980s. He created all kinds of fear, saying it could affect the entire population when it couldn't, Johnson said on Fox News December the 1st. Public health is now religion, with appeals to authority having replaced citation, scientific empiricism, and debate as the source of truth. The press treats Fauci's pronouncements with an infallibility that would make medieval popes envious. Subsumed in this orthodoxy, media outlets have been complicit in Dr. Fauci's disastrous mismanagement of the pandemic. With 4.2% of the world's population, America under Fauci's regimen racked up 20% of global COVID deaths. The media also covered up Dr. Fauci's historic atrocities in the same way Boston newspapers covered up the Catholic Church's pedophile scandals in the 1990s. Anyone who bothers to look at the history will find that Senator Johnson's assertion is accurate. As I chronicle in my book, Kennedy writes, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates Built Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health by 1983, it had become a hardwired reflex at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases to exaggerate public fears of pandemics, and Dr. Fauci's first instinct as National AIDS Czar had been to stoke contagion terror. He made himself a villain among AIDS activists with a fear-mongering 1983 article in the Journal of the AMA warning AIDS could spread by casual contact. At the time, AIDS was almost exclusive to intravenous drug users and males who had sex with other males, but Dr. Fauci incorrectly warned of, quote, the possibility that routine close contact, as within a family household, can spread the disease, unquote. Given that non-sexual, non-bloodborne transmission is possible, according to Fauci, the scope of the syndrome may be enormous. In his History of the AIDS Crisis, and the band played on, Arthur Randy Schultz reported that the world's leading AIDS experts, Ayer Rubinstein, was astounded at Fauci's stupidity because his statement did not reflect the contemporary scientific knowledge. The best scientific evidence suggested that the infectivity of HIV, even in intimate contact, to be so negligible as to be incapable of sustaining a general epidemic. Nevertheless, Dr. Fauci's reflexive response was to amplify the widespread panic of dreaded pestilence that would naturally magnify his power, elevate his profile, and expand his influence. Amplifying terror of infectious disease was already an ingrained knee-jerk institutional response at NIAID. In 1987, the Wall Street Journal won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation of a U.S. Department of Health and Human Services scheme its writers characterized as a deliberate campaign by officials to misrepresent AIDS as a general pandemic to secure greater public funding and financial support. The flim-flam worked. Terror of pestilence, it turns out, is a potent impulse, and Fauci was adept at weaponizing it, and he quickly learned the other respected authorities would follow his lead. Following Dr. Fauci's fear-mongering prophecy, Teresa Crenshaw of the President's AIDS Commission made the astonishing forecast that within 14 years, double the number of people then on the planet would be dying from the lethal infections. Sorry about that. Crenshaw's dire soothsaying never materialized. In 2007, the World Health Organization estimated that only 33.2 million people worldwide were HIV positive. The Oprah Show broadcast Crenshaw's subsequent prognostication that by 1990, 1 in 5 heterosexuals may be dead of AIDS. Thankfully, this prognosis was also hyperbolic. According to CDC data, about 1 in 250 Americans test HIV positive. Outside the risk groups, this number drops to about 1 in 5,000. The hysteria following Fauci's dystopian prediction prompted Der Spiegel to warn AIDS infections would entirely exterminate the German population by 1992. The following year, the magazine Bild der Wissenschaft also forecast the prompt extinction of the Teutonic race. Dr. Fauci's embellishments quickly made HIV positives the modern equivalent of lepers. Paranoia of AIDS from non-sexual contact persisted for years. In New York in 1985, for instance, 85% of school children at one public elementary school stayed home during opening week, while hundreds of parents demanded the school system bar any HIV-positive children from attending classes. The Reagan administration made it unlawful for persons with AIDS to enter the United States. The Cuban government quarantined AIDS victims in modern leper colonies. AIDS activists charged Dr. Fauci with causing the irrational punitive response that followed his hysterical statements. A year later, growing furor over his assertion forced Dr. Fauci to acknowledge that health officials had never detected a single case of the disease spread through casual contact. Why he wasn't sacked for this or worse, and this doesn't, in this piece, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. does not get into the AZT scandal, which I've spoken about previously in this space. Anyway, this is at Lew Rockwell, that's Lew, Rockwell.com. I highly recommend this essay. And let's see. Oh, yes, I was talking about the Catholic Church previously. This is from lifesitenews.com. German Catholics protest Archdiocese of Berlin banning unvaccinated from attending Mass. Well, they don't believe in God. They don't believe in the Catholic faith. They have an idol that they worship instead, and it's the vaccine. And, oh, this is too funny. Too funny. This is from Breitbart. Finland's Prime Minister Sanna Marin missed a Wuhan coronavirus contact alert because she had left her government phone at home when she went out partying at a Helsinki nightclub. Chris Tomlinson is the reporter. The millennial Prime Minister was alerted to possible COVID-19 contact exposure after Finland's Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto, who the Premier had met with on Friday, tested positive for the virus. However, Marin missed alerts instructing her to limit contacts on Saturday evening, which were sent to her ministerial government telephone. So an attractive woman, I must say. But no, it's just too funny. And this is from liberals of TikTok. Libs of TikTok, rather. Board member of NEA, the largest teachers union, saying unvaxxed should die or be shot. And NEA today is silent. Molly Page Mumau had written on Facebook, screw this guy and screw them all who are all about hiding behind religious exemptions because they don't want anybody to tell them what to do. People tell you what to do all the time, and you do it. This is such BS. He and his ilk deserve whatever comes their way, including losing jobs, getting sick, and perhaps dying from the virus. But in the meantime, he's going to put all the people around him in danger. I don't know why the GOP just doesn't take those guns they profess to love so much and just start shooting all of their constituents who think this way. It would be quicker and ultimately safer than putting me and my friends and family at risk. Teachers, don't you just love them? And in Florida, this is again Breitbart from Hannah Blow, Governor Ron DeSantis Tuesday criticized Faucism. I like that. I love that neologism. In the wake of the Omicron variant of the Chinese coronavirus, and promised Florida will continue to, quote, protect your freedom to make your decisions, unquote. Speaking from Oldsmar, Florida, DeSantis briefly mentioned the emergence of the Omicron variant and the market's initial reaction to that, noting it was not fearful of the virus, but rather, quote, fearful that governments would do destructive things in response to Omicron. And in Florida, we won't let them lock you down. We won't let them restrict you. We're not going to let them impose mandates. We're not going to let them close schools. We're going to protect your freedom to make your decisions. Well, all I can say to that is bravo. And do we have some news from New Zealand? Come on, we must have some news from New Zealand here, right? Oh no, here we go. Here we go. This is from Summit News, Paul Joseph Watson. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has candidly revealed that, quote, there's not going to be an end point to this vaccination program, unquote. Yes, really. So long as there's people who are eligible who haven't been vaccinated, we've got work to do. Do you know, I don't think I'll ever be satisfied so long as there's someone who is eligible and hasn't been vaccinated. There's not going to be an end point to this vaccination program, unquote. The Prime Minister called on people who got jabbed 6 months ago to come back for another shot. Ardern delivered the message while adopting her familiar passive-aggressive smiley mannerism, as seen many times before when she casually revealed the next step in COVID authoritarianism. I've been working on an impression of Jacinda Ardern. It needs a little work. We'll just let this pass. Okay, there we go. Well, no, not yet. Not yet. Okay, that's better. Okay, my impression of Jacinda Ardern, it needs a little work, but this is the basis, okay? This is the bedrock. There we go. I think that pretty much sums it up, wouldn't you say? There's a piece, it's spiked online. Oh, they must be across the street. Oh, what is this? The Purge? Just a second. Okay. This is a piece that's spiked online by Dara McManus called Where Have All the Adults Gone? Adults are sacrificing children's well-being to make themselves feel safe. Harry Potter and COVID-19 are together at last. Well, not at last. For one thing, you can already buy Harry Potter branded face masks, but the two became entangled in my mind last week when on the same day, a message popped into my inbox about two big deal telespectaculars marking the first film's 20th anniversary, and news broke of a mandate here in Ireland forcing children to wear masks in school. The Potter stuff airing... I'm sorry, folks, there's nothing I can do about this. The Potter stuff airing over Christmas on Sky involves Return to Hogwarts, where cast members reminiscence about how wonderful everyone was, etc. in Hogwarts. Tournament of Houses, which is some sort of game show quiz thing hosted by Helen Mirren, in which Wizarding World fans put their Harry Potter knowledge to the test. I'm assuming this stuff is mostly aimed at adults, and the game show will mainly comprise adult competitors. And from the producer's standpoint, why not? Harry Potter is huge with people who, how to put this nicely, probably should have given up reading and watching children's stories about magic and witches with absurdly rococo names a few decades ago. Age-inappropriate Pottermania is one of the most striking demonstrations of the fact that we live in a woefully infantilized culture, which brings me back to COVID. This Masks for Little Kids directive is awful, obviously. Since March 2020, the Irish government has deprived young people of so much, stripping back more and more of their rights and freedoms. Schools were closed for months. Extracurricular classes are still in abeyance. Vaccine passes have to be shown to get a hot chocolate, and so on. The physical, psychological, and social damage of such measures is obvious. In terms of masks, adolescents have been wearing them at school since last autumn. Now the government has introduced masks for primary pupils from third class, 8 to 9-year-olds upwards. They're also floating the idea of vaccinating kids as young as 5. Zealots in positions of authority and influence drove this through. Quiescent parents went along. As a parent myself, though mainly as a normally functioning human being, I find it kind of insane. From a child protection standpoint, it's totally unnecessary. The vast majority of young people suffer few ill effects from COVID. So despite Ireland's health minister, Stephen Donnelly, droning endlessly on about keeping children safe, nobody can answer one simple question: safe from what exactly? A virus that causes them very little harm? Clearly, then, none of this is for the kids' benefit. The only logical conclusion is being done to protect adults, which at least is a position, although one I'd vehemently disagree with. It seems that children are being sacrificed for some so-called greater good. They're being burdened with protecting public health or reducing infectious spread, things they shouldn't even be aware of, let alone involved in. They've lost much more than adults throughout COVID and gained nothing. Well, you will recall that Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, actually said this in public, that, oh, yes, kids, getting vaxxed 5 years and up. This is so that adults will have a greater sense of urgency. Yeah, I'm just getting, I get a strange, unpleasant feelings when I hear things about that. And I start thinking about George Sorel and his political philosophy. Back to spiked health education and privacy activities, playdates, and rites of passage. Their very youth, supposed to be free of care, has been made rotten by grown-up cowardice, zealotry, and perhaps most of all, immaturity. Which brings us back around to good old Harry once more. I thought at first it was just ironic that we live in an increasingly infantilized adult culture. I'm 40 and Gryffindor forever, which at the same time increasingly piles responsibility onto kids. We all have to do our bit in this crisis, including you 7-year-olds. Then I realized it's not ironic at all. This infantilized culture is one of the main reasons for the COVID burden being placed on children. We're babies, unwilling to shoulder the full responsibility as we should. Obviously, it's not just about middle-aged Potter maniacs. You see this mortifying immaturity every time a grown-up screeches about a superhero movie not respecting the source material, or how the inclusion of Jar Jar Binks in a children's movie destroyed the franchise. God, I hope you get cancer. Every numpty who drags their kids along to protest against Trump, Israel, the intergalactic lizard people, every grown man who allows his sports team's results to define his happiness, every dingbat engaging in Twitter wars about Messi is the GOAT, loser Ronaldo is trash, a religious zealot and militant atheist. Every time someone cries at reality TV or John Lewis ads or an election not going how they wanted, every pampered student demanding safety rather than an education, every activist who proudly declares the personal is the political and then takes it well personally when someone disagrees with their politics, every activist, or most of them, every incident of cancel culture or OTT safetyism, everyone who can't abide free speech, differing opinions, or the apparently distressing possibility that incredibly they may actually be wrong about something, and sticks their fingers in their ears like a big blubbering baby. And you see how adults, hysterical, spineless, and self-centered, are willing to sacrifice children's well-being to keep themselves feeling safe. And again, this is by Dara McManus at Spiked, that is spiked-online.com. So a final look at the chat. True Greenbird, hello, says gender dysphoria and infantilization go hand in hand. You can't really be an adult until you grow up and embrace your biologically determined role, be a man, be a woman. Yes, I was thinking about this earlier today. There was a piece in Unheard saying that everyone knows what sexual orientation means. No, nobody knows what it means because it's a meaningless phrase. It is weasel words. And this orientation is fixed? No, it isn't. It's certainly not fixed according to the alphabet people who are constantly converting people. And of course, it's a commonplace that you read about some person, a man, a woman, supposedly homosexual, and then, married to a person of a different sex. But no, apparently this is supposed to be immutable. No, it's not immutable. It was a commonplace. Let's say, how far do we have to go back here? let's say 40 years ago, okay, that it was understood that immature children would have same-sex attractions, friendships, this sort of thing. And around 40 years ago, oh no, these children must be gay or lesbian, and this is immutable, and they're stuck in these hells for life. Yeah, again, I'm looking forward to the cadaver synod of all of the people responsible for this. Metal Mike says conversion therapy is illegal unless you want to convert to another gender. Then it's encouraged. Yes, exactly. Let that be a warning to any doctor who doesn't follow the script. This essay sounds a bit like Henry Fonda's speech in The Grapes of Wrath, says William Hicks. The show and chat have been great tonight. It started off deep and serious and then got light and funny. Well, that's the way I like to keep it. Prominent people attacking Alex Jones makes Jones stronger and adds viewers, says Metal Mike. Ashley Man Bravo says 2 Australian MPs recently went on InfoWars with Alex Jones, and now the Prime Minister has officially denounced and attacked Alex Jones. When the hell does de Blasio actually leave offices and run? Gammy says okay. Talking about something else here. The funeral was recent. Died in custody, allegedly. His wife spoke out. Could be a different guy. Same story, though. Palpicasso 88 says she thinks French Connection is dumb, but Harry Potter and Disney princess movies are great. The French Connection dumb? Okay. French Connection is outstanding. Outstanding. All 3 Biden mandates are halted, says True Greenbird. I'm not sure if my HR department knows this yet, waiting for a response. My 37-year-old girl cousin is a huge Harry Potter fan. It's sad. One of my daughters, who is over 30, was obsessed with Harry Potter when she was, in school, and everyone was. Oh, you have to buy the book on the first day, which was a Saturday. Books normally drop, as they like to say, on Tuesday. I have to buy it? You have to buy it for me. Well, why Saturday? What difference does it make? Because everyone's getting it on Saturday, and everyone's going to read it so that they can talk about it on Monday morning. Since books are like this thick, so I bought the books on Saturday, and then when the first movie came out, you have to see it opening night. Okay, all the theaters are sold out. No. Oh, apparently they've added a midnight showing. Oh, so you can get to bed at 2:30 on a school night? Well, you got your Harry Potter, so you can talk about it the next day. But she still carries on about it. And oh no, this controversy about J.K. Rowling. Oh, it's divided the Harry Potter community. Ugh. Anron says, Kevin, please use a rebarbative and rococo in a sentence. Thanks in advance. Perhaps tomorrow. William Hicks says, the sirens provide great atmospheric urgency. No apologies needed. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. What is coming up this week? Theater Thursday tomorrow. And I'm talking about a movie from 1960 by Gillo Pontecorvo called Capo. It's starring Susan Strasberg. It's a very grim movie indeed. And on the book club Friday, I'm going to be talking about a novel by Teresa Waugh, or Lady Teresa Waugh, her full title, who is the widow of Oberyn Waugh. It's a novel called Waterloo, and it's about a retired military man and his younger wife, and their life in a village in the West Country in England. And I suppose it's a novel about disappointments and resentments. I think it is really quite beautiful. On Music Monday, December 13th, I'm going to be talking about the Beatles' last release, though not recorded album, called Let It Be. And I'm going to express some irritation at the repeated attempts to persuade us or to bully us into believing that it is a fine album and up to the standards established by the Beatles in previous records. So I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would be very much appreciated, since what is it, the 8th today? So I have 15 days before it comes due for the next month. And I don't know, I really can't count on my father's estate lawyer, even despite promises which were made as recently as 3 weeks ago. If you'd like to make a donation, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And once again, thank you so much to those who have donated. As always, I leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.